Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. This is the fourth episode in a series dedicated to Docker, and in today's video we'll be exploring Docker Compose, which is an essential tool for any developer's toolkit. We'll walk through writing a Docker Compose file step by step, and we'll use it in setting up a fully functional WordPress site with its own MySQL database. By the end of this video, the goal is for you to have a clear understanding of each configuration line and how they work together to manage complex applications with ease. So let's get started. What is Docker Compose? Docker Compose is a tool that simplifies the management of multi-container Docker applications. So by using a YAML file, it allows you to configure the necessary services, networks, and volumes all in one place. And this approach is particularly useful for maintaining consistency across different environments. Now let's get straight into the practical part. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to set up a WordPress environment using Docker Compose. And this will include a WordPress container and a separate MySQL database container. I'll then walk you through each line of our configuration file to ensure that you know exactly what each parameter does. So head over to your terminal and first let's create a file called docker-compose, docker-compose.yml, right? This YAML file will define all the services required for our WordPress site. So let's break it down section by section. Before Docker Compose version 1.27.0, you'll be required to start your Docker Compose file by specifying a version. But for more recent versions, you can omit the version key. So first, let's configure our MySQL database service. We'll do that by typing db. By the way, indentation is really key when defining YAML configurations. So I'll suggest that you get very familiar with writing YAML files as they are very handy and widely used. Now let's get back to our configuration. So for db that we specified, this is basically the name of our service, our database service, right? And this is how we refer to our database within the Docker network. Next thing we need to do is to specify the Docker image to use. So let's use MySQL version 5.7 from Docker Hub. So we'll do that by typing image colon MySQL and the version tag 5.7, right? As this is a database, we need to persist data so it remains available between container restarts. And to do this, we define a volume mapping by entering volume, so volumes, plural, as there could be multiple. And then we want to have a list, right? In YAML, you identify a list with a hyphen, right? So let's name our volume db_data, right? And then we also need to specify a directory. So let's do /var/lib/libraries/MySQL, right? Basically, this configuration tells Docker to ensure that the directory /var/lib/MySQL inside the running container uses the db data volume, which we'll get to shortly. Next, we want Docker to automatically restart this container if it ever stops unexpectedly, and to do that we enter restart with a colon, and we set that to always. Next thing we need to do is to set environment variables that the MySQL image will use to configure itself. And basically our WordPress service will need to provide these credentials for it to successfully access our MySQL database. So we'll do that by entering environment, so set environment variables, and then we set our environment variables. So first let's set a MySQL root password, MySQL root password. Let's just call it some WordPress. By the way, don't try this at home. Just kidding. But really, it's not best practice to enter, sensitive pieces of information as plain text within configuration files. It's advisable to leverage, secret management tools like HashiCorp Vault, IBM Vault, AWS Secrets Manager, and so on and so forth. but for the purpose of this demo, we'd have it in plain text. So next, let's configure our MySQL database name. So MySQL, let's call it database, and let's name it WordPress. Next, we need a MySQL user, so a database user, and let's say MySQL user, we can call it WordPress again. And next, let's enter a password for our MySQL user. So let's give that MySQL password, and we can also call that WordPress. And that's it for our database service. Next, let's configure our WordPress service, and we'll do that by entering WordPress on the same indentation as the DB, as you can see. So next thing we want to do is to enter a depends on DB. And just as it sounds, it just means that our WordPress container would be able to start only after the MySQL container is up and running. So the next thing, let's enter our image. And for our image, let's use the WordPress and the tag latest. Next, let's define a port mapping, which will basically map port 80 within our WordPress container to a certain port like 8000 on our host machine or laptop, making the site accessible via localhost on the port 8000 in our browser. In the last episode in this series, we also had to configure some port mapping. So we do that by entering ports in plural, and then it's a list. So we define our ports. So the port on our local machine, which is 8000, and we're mapping it to port 80. So we put this in quotes, and that's our port mapping. So similar to our database, let's make sure the WordPress service restarts automatically if it ever stops. So we do that by entering restart always. Cool. And next, let's set the environment variables needed for WordPress to connect to the MySQL database. And as we did before, we'll do the same thing again. So we enter environment, and we'll define our environment variables. So first, let's have the WordPress DB hosts. And for this, we'll specify our database host, which is the service name DB. So DB on, DB on the MySQL port, and MySQL default port is 3306. So next, let's enter a WordPress DB user. DB user, which will correspond to the user we created above. So that's WordPress in small letters, WordPress. We'll also want to enter the WordPress DB password. So WordPress DB password. And that's also equivalent to the password above, which is also WordPress. And lastly, let's enter the DB name, WordPress DB underscore name, which will be equivalent to the DB name here, which is also WordPress. Lastly, let's define a volume configuration to store our database data. And this named volume, which we've used here, DB data, will be managed by Docker and attached to our MySQL service to ensure persistence, just like I explained above. So we do that by entering volumes, and as simple as just doing a DB underscore data and a colon. Basically, and in a Docker file, volumes have the same indentation with services. Awesome. So we've put together our docker-compose file, and now let's put our configuration to work. So head over to your terminal. So I go my terminal, and navigate to the directory containing your docker-compose YAML file. So in my case, I'm in the directory, but I can confirm by doing an ls, and truly my docker-compose file is in this directory. To get our DB and WordPress services up and running, all we need to do is enter a docker compose up. On Windows and Mac, Docker Desktop includes Docker Compose. So if you install Docker Desktop, you also get Docker Compose as part of that installation. But if you run Linux, you need to install Docker Compose separately from Docker. So let's get back to our Docker Compose up command. This command launches our Docker containers according to the settings we've defined in the Docker Compose YAML file. And Docker Compose will pull all the necessary images, set up the network, and launch our containers. So let's run enter. There seems to be an error. No matching manifest for Linux ARM v8 in the manifest list entries. Okay, I've seen this before. So basically this error occurs because by default, Docker tries to pull an image that's compatible with your system's architecture. So in my case is, ARM64, just like it says here, and the WordPress image apparently doesn't support this architecture. So to fix this, I have to explicitly specify the supported platform, which should be Linux, AMD64. So let's specify that for each of our services. So we just have to do platform, and we'll give it the Linux AMD64. Let's copy this and put the exact same thing for our WordPress container as well. Let's save that and run our Docker Compose up one more time. So now it seems to be running fine. WordPress is being pulled and the DB container as well. WordPress image and the DB image have been pulled. And our application seems to be running now, right? And because I did not run Docker Compose up in detached mode or in the background, I won't be able to do much on my terminal without stopping this process. So let's head over to the browser and confirm that WordPress is running on port 8000. So we'll do that by running localhost 8000. So we can see the WordPress admin installation page come up. I have no intentions of installing WordPress, but this is just for you to see how Docker Compose works. But if you click on continue, it asks for the site title, username, password, and other details. And then you can proceed with the WordPress installation. We've just walked through setting up a WordPress environment using Docker Compose, explaining every detail of our configuration file. This approach not only ensures consistency across different environments, but it also gives you a robust framework for managing complex container setups. Thank you for joining me today. In our next episode, we'll explore Docker networking, where you can learn how to connect containers across Docker hosts, manage network traffic, and secure communications between containers. So make sure you tune in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you found it informative. Also feel free to drop your questions or topics you'd like me to cover in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.